Time to introduce our first speaker. He is a man with a long and very loaded title, befitting of his experience, knowledge, and skill set. He's a professor of architecture and urbanism and head of CB Research and Development at the Urban Planning Department in the Ministry of Municipality of Environment, and I'm not ashamed to say that I had to Google that because I didn't know what it stood for. Now, before I come to his name, I'm trying to play the pronoun game. He spent years learning, teaching, and practicing in his field of archaeology. He's been featured extensively in newspapers, periodicals, and architectural magazines, both locally and internationally, and he has published more than 70 journals. Just think about that for a second. His presentation for us today is one of the most interesting topics we've hosted thus far, and I am terribly excited to hear it again because I already got a sneak peek. It's titled Museum, City, and Society. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, put your hands together to welcome Dr. Ali Alraouf here on stage. Dr. Ali, thank you so much for being here this day.
We gave you this one, so
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I'll use this. Is this active now? Oh, perfect. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm really honored and so grateful for the Doha Creatives team. I'm old, but not to the extent that I'm an expert in archaeology. I am an expert in architecture and urbanism. So, all right, this is a small correction. My talk is, I need to switch this. Right. My talk is about a triology that I'm really interested and excited about. Museums, city, and society, and how we can sort of revisit this relation, or at least to start to establish it if it's not that much existed. A relation that I am personally excited about in my research, in my work, in my writings. And I think this relation is kind of very interesting to the location of Gulf cities and the culture that we are kind of subscribed to, in the sense that a lot of us know that museums goers tradition is not that popular within the Gulf. So in my narrative, in my story, I will try to shed some light on if there is a possibility if we revisit this connection between museums, city, and society to overcome this. And also, what is the role that architecture and urban design and planning can offer? And therefore, I want to start with the notion of the city. And cities are sort of the invention of us. We should be extremely proud that we were able to have this new habitat that we belong to and we experience on a daily basis. And if we talk about the statistics, it's really amazing that half of the world's population are living in cities now, and the expectations of the UN Habitat that by 2050, more than 65% of the total world population will be living in cities. So the most important thing about cities now is to how to see the story of each city, how to dig deep in each city and overcome the desire to imitate other cities, but to look at the authentic, original narrative of each city. Speaking of statistics, I'm also excited about profound statistics regarding the museums. So museums are mushrooming all over the world, and it's becoming one of the most visited public places. So for instance, 80,000 museums are currently all over the world, huge number. This is according to economists. And then 850 million visitors visit American museums only in 1 year. Absolutely amazing numbers. So this is again relating me to the notion of how we can do this in the Middle East, how we can do this in the Gulf. Why my students, when I hear them talking about going to the library or going to the museum, the reaction of their colleagues would be, are you okay? Is there something wrong? Why you want to go to the museum? Why you want to go to the library? Why our perception of the library that it's only a quiet place that we would use during the exam week, as opposed to it's a place that we do belong to? This would take me to a sort of a juxtapositioning between the city and the museum, and how I can see the city as a museum and also the museum as a city. So in this sense, the city as a museum, I think the museum, the city here, the museum as a city is a way by which to see the museum as the new agora. Some people are saying that the museum are the new cathedral of our time, the cathedral of our modern time. We go to museums for spiritual uplifting, for education, for social integration, and so on and so forth. But also the city itself can be a museum in the sense that if again we search for the authentic components of the city, not only the spectacle of the city. So Burj Khalifa is definitely part of the story of Dubai, but also maybe a small kiosk somewhere in an alley is also part of the story. So this is again suggesting that the whole structure, the whole fabric of the city can be transformed into a museum. Streets, public spaces, buildings, alleys, people, and so on and so forth. It's a way by which we can see the city as a sort of a stage, as a sort of a campus that we learn from it. Wonderful example in the Middle East would be Sidi Bou Said in Tunisia, a wonderful, wonderful city that you can learn from every single corner in the city. The city is an open museum, but it's a living museum. It's not the kind of museum that you would look at a piece of art, but you would interact with this in it, because there's an authentic life and authentic people living and enjoying the place. And then the notion of also museums can be a sort of a catalyst for democracy, because if museums are for people, geared for people, and allowing people to get together and talk about the future of their cities, and talk about the future of their societies, in this sense, the museum can be seen as a sort of a force for democracy. So the new kind of notion of museum is also transcending the fact that it's a place where you go to encounter works of art, but also you can encounter a dialogue, a debate about the future of the city. Another interesting paradigm shift in my understanding of museums that I want to share with you today is also related to how we look at the identity of the museums. And we usually subscribe to the view that museums are only for the elite. It's a place for the well-educated people. And therefore, by sort of celebrating this notion, we created a barrier between people and museums. And therefore, the new kind of interpretation now is how to make museums again for people from different cultural backgrounds, different social backgrounds, economical backgrounds, and even ideological backgrounds. And the other interesting notion is how to transform those alien landmarks, places for the sophisticated, elite, well-educated people into seeds for urban development. So in this sense, from an architecture and urban planning point of view, the museum is not isolated, but the museum is in the heart of the city and are surrounded by a lot of activities that would engage people and attract people to it. Those are examples scattered all over the world, all of them suggesting the fact that we are moving from looking at museums as single, individual, isolated buildings into an entity within a more vibrant center. And this would lead me a bit to the story of Gulf cities. And I want to start, this is because I also, like a lot of Doha creatives, I like very much reading books and novels. And I would recommend, if you want to have a more comprehensive, holistic understanding about the development of Gulf cities, I would definitely recommend the work of Abdurrahman Nayef, precisely Cities of Salt, where he was able to brilliantly depict the the transformation that took place in the Gulf when they discovered oil and how this affects the whole cultural, physical, and socio-economic structure of the Gulf communities and Gulf cities. But more interestingly, in 2009, another wonderful book was published, again a novel called Tsunami by Hamoud Al-Sa'iq, which is basically a fake name because the book was banned from precisely Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. And this book is about envisioning the Gulf in 2195, so almost 200 from today. And from the very, very first paper, the first page of the novel, Hamoud Al-Sa'iq is talking about a young Saudi guy waiting in line in front of the Bangladeshi embassy in Saudi Arabia, trying to get a work visa to travel to Bangladesh to work as a driver. This is harsh, but it's a wonderful, wonderful ringing bell because it's suggesting that we need to think about the post-oil paradigm. We need to think about the day after when the oil dried up. So we don't want this young man to stand in front of the Bangladeshi embassy to go to travel and work as a driver. So what we should do? Another interesting thing that took place in the last year and a half, and ironically it starts from Abu Dhabi and we turn back to Abu Dhabi, the very first solar-powered plane that took a trip around the whole world without using a single drop of oil. And the irony here is that the plane was flying on top of all the glass skyscrapers where the oil money was used to build, without considering the notions of sustainability, the notions of the day after, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that the post-carbon paradigm is not a vision, it's a reality. This is what we are living and what we should be prepared for. And in this sense, I'm also excited about the work of Charles Florida and two wonderful books. The first is The Rise of the Creative Class. People like you, young ambitions, they have assets in their mind. Their mind is full of activities, creativity, initiatives, and they are willing to travel the world. So in this sense, after he wrote the first book, he did realize that there's a new geography is coming. There's a new relation between people and places because of this rise of the creative class, because of people like you that are willing to look at the map and select the right city that would create for you the right environment by which you maintain your creativity and positive contribution in the world. Another interesting contribution is related to the work of Charles Landry. And here I'm so excited about the notion of the creative city and how, again, he is challenging our perception of the city, that the city is not only about roads and skyscrapers and shopping malls and all these typical kind of vision of the city, but it's also about art and creativity and heritage and public art and design and so on. So it seems to me that Gulf cities, they were in a sort of a fallacy. This is what I call the fallacy of the contemporary Gulf cities, when they were competing together to build either more or bigger or higher. Right? And I think it's about also another interesting feature in the Gulf that they built a lot of museums, and also those museums were built again to brand cities. So I think we are entering a new paradigm in terms of architecture and urbanism, and I see this clearly in Qatar, that we have this dialogue between what is now becoming a trend in the world, knowledge-based urban development that would enhance the presence of people like you, research center, universities, top schools, public spaces, museums, and also there's a sort of a balance between local and global urbanism. But yet we still have the questions of the myth of the community integration, how to integrate the community, and also how to overcome the notion of museum goers. I would very quickly narrate the story of the two museums that I'm excited about here in Qatar, the Museum of Islamic Art, designed by IMPay, and the Qatar National Museums, designed by Jan Novell. The very first one, the Museum of Islamic Art, inspired by a wonderful, wonderful mosque in Egypt, the Mosque of Ahmed ibn Toulon. And again, beautiful, beautiful interpretation of the identity of Islam and identity of the Arab world. Great exhibiting spaces. But I'm so excited about the notion of how the museum was able to create a sort of connection between the place and the community, and how this connection is even not that much related to the collections, as opposed to related to bringing people inside the place, and therefore suddenly you have a beautiful, beautiful park adjacent and full of activities that are inviting people to interact with the place. I did a lot of interviews when I was writing some of my book chapters, and I was excited that people would go to the park and they discover that this big building is a museum, and therefore after that they would. So the museum, going to the museum, is becoming kind of a byproduct as opposed to imposed activity. People are enjoying the outdoor places, and in the process they go to the museum. And then the Qatar National Museum also is a very, very interesting place in the sense that, again, it's a wonderful balance between the old and the new, the heritage and the future. And it's also related and inspired by the environmental dimension of the desert roses. But I'm also excited about how the project is adopting a sort of a provocative architectural language, a language that would inspire people to ask questions. It's not the typical building that you drive by without inspiring you and provoking you. Even during the construction, a lot of questions coming from what's going on in this place. So this is in itself, the sense of curiosity about the place is also interesting. And then again, the notion of the blurred lines between the indoor and the outdoor, and how the museum is sucking people inside and inviting them to enjoy the places. So to make a long story short, I think Qatar, and precisely Doha, is creating a sort of a new urban brand based on this knowledge-based urban development. And the museums are, again, sort of connecting community in the city via this blurred line between internal and external spaces. Provocative and exciting architecture is important. The balance between modernization and also between the heritage and tradition is highly recommended. And then knowledge-based urban development is definitely the future of Gulf cities. Thank you so much for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ali, we're going to keep it up for a second for Q&A. Thank you so much. Very interesting topic. One that I'm sure a lot of you are going to have questions for. We're only going to be able to take 2 or 3 questions. And we've got one right there in the back. If we can get a microphone.
You shouldn't have mentioned that I was the first speaker. You dove me now. Thank you, Dr. Ali. Quick question. You've mentioned that the total number of museum visitors in the US is 85 million. A simple thing like...
In 1 year.
In 1 year, yeah. Pokemon Go got millions of users in 1 day. So my question is not really about the game, but it's about the effect of technology. Something like augmented reality or virtual reality technology is expected to change the museum industry or the museum sector or the museums generally as we speak. A lot of the museums are now considering having their exhibits as a virtual reality offering, because that's basically easier, cheaper, faster, and people don't have to travel. But then again, that somehow loses the idea of the urban center that you mentioned. So what's your view on that? Do you see that as an enabler or as a changer, or how do you see it?
Thank you, Aziz. This is a wonderful question. And I would answer it not using the prototype of the museums. I would share with you a wonderful story. The director of the British Library, he just wrote something very interesting for the visitors of the library. And he said, eat, drink, and laugh, you are in the library. So he is suggesting that, with all my due respect to the digital media, libraries and museums are not only about reading a book or about looking at a piece of art. It's about getting together. This is the new notion of cultural buildings in the whole world. And therefore, yes, definitely, there are a lot of virtual tours for a lot of museums around the world now. But none of those tours would help you to get together, me and you, and talk